With marquee titles like Street Fighter 6 and Tekken 8 expanding beyond the range of traditional 6-button arcade stick layouts, leverless controllers have seen a boom in new layouts and form factors, with a small niche of controllers introducing analog functions. Enter the Fightbox F6 Gen-5x. This mouthful of a controller sports Brook's latest PS5 and Xbox-compatible hardware, a mixbox-style layout with keyboard keys for movement and full-size arcade action buttons, and 2 analog thumbsticks. The thumbsticks utility has immediate, obvious applications in modes like Tekken and Street Fighter's lobbies and story mode, but with a full set of inputs on board, I couldn't help but wonder what other styles of games Fightbox's controller could bring the satisfaction of arcade controls to. Is this a truly next-gen evolution of the leverless controller, or another entry in a sea of leverless controllers with novelty gimmicks? Starting with the build quality, the Fightbox has a utilitarian design, with a combination of a metal chassis, 2 acrylic top panels, and little flair aside from the Fightbox logo embossed on the bottom. By default, it's all black, with an unremarkable box shape, with only the red keycaps adding a splash of color. You can order a transparent acrylic top for adding artwork, but instead I opted to vinyl wrap the top layer, then replace the keycaps with my own set to match the art. Its metal chassis does give it more heft than its budget contemporaries, and even without that it's surprisingly thin, without going into complete flat box territory. If there's one major fault to its build quality, it's the use of plastic rivets to secure the top. Fightbox seems to be borrowing a trick from the original Hitbox company here, and while these give a smooth look to the top panel, they're a pain to remove without a dedicated tool, requiring you to remove the feet on the bottom panel first, then blindly poke through the opening to pop out the rivets from beneath. These rivets are easy to lose in the process, and it puts a countdown on how many times you can open up this case before one of them fails. Thankfully, the rest of the build is much more straightforward. The wiring is split out to a cleanly labeled breakout board for wire management, but otherwise uses the 20-pin headers on the full-size Brook board, making it easy to trace the connections and change button mappings. The screw terminals are left unpopulated, allowing you to easily swap mappings or add additional buttons, and the analog sticks are simply mounted using electronic standoffs and a custom PCB. As for the controls themselves, the analog sticks are ALP sticks, similar to the ones found on PlayStation controllers, and the thumb caps can easily be removed and replaced, though it might cause clearance issues that would prevent full movement. They can also be pressed down to activate the L3 and R3 buttons. The keyboard keys uses MX black switches, and the arcade buttons are Sanwa, leading to a bit of a mismatch in the force required for actuation. The black switches need more force than the standard cherry red or speed silver you'll usually find on gaming controllers and keyboards, and the Sanwa buttons actuate if you breathe on them, so you'll either need an adjustment period to make sure you don't hit the buttons before finishing a motion, or swap out the switches and buttons to match. Thankfully, the buttons are easily swappable, and the keyboard switches have hot swap sockets. The side buttons use generic 24mm arcade buttons of noticeably worse quality, though this seems to be the standard even with larger brands like Hitbox. They're still perfectly functional, though without a proper lockout switch, you're liable to accidentally hit them. The default positions of the start and home buttons are particularly egregious, placed on the side where it's particularly easy to hit them during lap play. These are the buttons most likely to get you disqualified or interfere with a match, so I recommend you swap them out if you plan to play competitive. I personally moved all the function buttons to the back, then removed the redundant L3 and R3 buttons and replaced them with aux ports to connect external controls to. I also remapped the controls to place the face buttons in positions more similar to the traditional cross shape, with the left and right shoulders at the 1P and 3P positions. The default layout will work perfectly fine out of the box for fighting games, but it's awkward for other games. Swapping the positions like this made it more intuitive for me, especially in 3D games, though the trigger buttons admittedly stay in an awkward position. I would have loved to see Fightbox rethink their layout to better fit the variety of games analog controls could make playable, with either the addition of thumb buttons or even just a steeper diagonal slant to make the final column of buttons easier to reach. The current option feels like a functional but slightly uncomfortable compromise. The same is true of the Brook PCB that powers the controller. Software remappable controls and controller profiles have been promised by Brook, which would make this a much more flexible controller and make more titles playable, but as of writing, it doesn't currently exist. So what is the Gen-5x good for? I tested a variety of genres to push at the limits of what was playable and found a couple of good use cases for it. Fighting games were an obvious winner. While I personally prefer a hitbox style layout for fighting games, the mixbox layout still provides precision movement and might even be preferable for fans of 3D fighting games. Anything that primarily uses 6 buttons or less was pretty comfortable, especially if they had remappable controls. Rakugaki, a graffiti-themed 3D platformer, played pretty well. It even Shadow Generations was pretty playable. Platform fighters like Smash Ultimate and Rivals of Ether felt great on it, with the arcade layout lending itself well to rapid inputs and precise timing. I tend to favor the right stick for aerials as well, and it was easy to integrate those inputs. By the same token, I enjoyed using this controller for Decline's drops, which heavily borrows from games like Smash for its movement and combat system. It was particularly fun to chain wave dashes to skate across stages at high speed. Games that lean heavily on aiming are basically out of the question. It's too easy to let your thumb slip when trying to operate the trigger buttons and stick at the same time. Games that use the triggers and shoulder buttons as main attacks are going to be cumbersome, so don't count on playing something like a Souls game on it. Even with those limitations, it still leaves a generous amount of titles on the table, more than the average leverless, even if it's held back by the lack of software customization. Should Brook deliver on their promise to add controller profiles, a lot more games will become viable. If you're in the market for a mixbox-style controller with PS5 and Xbox compatibility, and you prefer full-size arcade buttons to acrylic stacks and keyboard switches, the F6 Gen-5x will give you a hefty controller for less than most licensed leverless controllers, with true analog functionality. It requires some modding to reach its full potential, but with a straightforward build and surprisingly spacious case, there's plenty to work with, provided you're willing to deal with the hassle of opening it up. As for myself, I enjoyed the foundation the Gen-5x provided for customization, and the key cluster and analog combo made a lot more games playable than the standard leverless. I'm not likely to have it in my rotation for competitive games, since there's such tough competition, but I'll likely be returning to it for rhythm games and more casual gaming sessions.